Welcome back to Poetry Corner. We've got a return today to our old friend Rudyard Kipling for a little poem called The Rose, inspired by the Middle Eastern wisdom tradition. It's a very metaphorical poem with a certain gentle wisdom to it, I think. So as usual, we'll hear the poem recited, and then I will make some suggestions about its meaning and what we can learn from it. Let's hear Rudyard Kipling's The Rose. A rose, in tatters on the garden path, cried out to God and murmured 'gainst his wrath, because a sudden breeze at twilight's hush had snapped her stem alone of all the bush. And God, who hears both sun-dried earth and sun, gave answer, murmuring to that luckless one, "Daughter, in that thou say'st we did not well, what voices heardst thou when thy petals fell?" The rose said, in that evil hour a voice asked, "Father, wherefore falls the flower? For lo, the very gossamers are still." And a voice answered, "Son, by the Lord's will." Then softly as a rain mist on the sward came to the rose the answer of the Lord. "Daughter, before we smote the dark in twain, ere yet the stars knew on another plain, time, tide, and space, we bound unto the task that thou shouldst fall, and such a one should ask." Thereat the withered flower, all content, died as they die whose days are innocent, whilst he who questioned why the flower fell caught hold of God and saved his soul from hell. Well, it's one of the oldest and hardest questions for Christianity, as for Islam and Judaism, to grapple with. If God is all-powerful and all-loving, why does he allow suffering to happen to good people? This poem is not a full answer, and of course, as a little poem, it can come across as quite glib in its simplicity. But I think there is an element of wisdom to it. The poem, of course, abstracts the problem into the story of a rose that suffers uniquely, unusually, compared to the other roses. A wind snaps her stem alone of all the bush. She's singled out, the rose is singled out for suffering, for no obvious reason, and feels the injustice of it, cries out to God and murmurs against his wrath, complains about what he has done. And God asks the rose, "What did you hear when this happened to you?" The rose recounts this conversation between a father and son, in which the son asks why this strange thing has happened, that one rose alone should fall. And the father says, because it is God's will. And God replies that at the beginning of creation, it was planned that this rose should have its stem broken. This piece of suffering that the rose experienced was not an accident or carelessness or callousness. It was written into the blueprints of the universe before light or darkness was brought into being. In other words, it has a purpose. It has a meaning, even if the rose can't see it. And the final verse, or the final few lines, tell us that the rose passed in peace, knowing that her suffering, her fall, had had a purpose, while he who questioned why the flower fell caught hold of God and saved his soul from hell. The fall of a rose led somebody back to God. The message, the meaning here is, of course, in essence, a very simple one. We can't see why things happen. We can't see what the consequences of the things that we do or the things that happen to us may be. If the fall of a rose can save a soul from hell, what may the things that we do and say and experience achieve? If the suffering of a rose can have cosmic meaning because it saves a soul, what may the suffering of a human being achieve? When we see, or heaven forfend, experience suffering, struggle, for no obvious reason, it doesn't mean there is no reason. Just as the rose couldn't see the impact of her fall, so we can't always see the impact of the things we undergo and experience. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a logic behind them, that there isn't a reason, that there isn't a purpose, that they're not going to be used by God to achieve great things. That might not be very much comfort at the time, but I think it is true. And for a explicitly biblical comparison, consider this. I asked the question, if the fall of a rose could save a soul, what might the suffering of a person achieve? And of course, for Christians, the answer is, well, once upon a time, the suffering of one person saved the world, saved all humanity. That was the case for Jesus. As he hung upon the cross, the bystanders could not have told what was going on. As his friends and his family and his mother stood at the foot of the cross, they would not have been able to tell what the reason was why a loving God would allow this to happen. They couldn't see any good reason for it. They couldn't see any purpose in it, any good in it at all. And yet that day, the darkest day in history, the worst crime that ever happened, the worst suffering that an innocent person ever underwent, was achieving the greatest good, the brightest day in history, the redemption of the whole human race. We can't see the ripples that spread out from every event in our lives. We can't see what impact we may have. And sometimes that impact isn't even through our actions. Like the rose, sometimes the impact is just through those who watch our lives, what happens to us and how we respond to it. A lot of things happen in this world, good things and bad things, easy things and hard things. Kipling's poem reminds us that none of them happen without a purpose, and that none of them happen without consequences. It may be that as we're struggling with what seems pointless, unnecessary suffering, that same story is saving somebody else's life for eternity. It may be that as we struggle with saying the right word, that word turns somebody else's life around. It may be that even the fall of a rose could save a soul from hell.